Hello and welcome to Tech Talk. I'm your host Seth Miller, and for today's episode, Battle of the Bands, I'm joined by ThinKom CTO Bill Milroy. Bill, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Seth. It's great to be here.
A lot of acronyms in today's show, and one of the biggest challenges is FSS versus HTS, and talking about what those mean. Give us a little bit of background there.
FSS stands for Fixed Satellite Service, and that's kind of the service that probably everyone, if they know much about satellites, would imagine. So when you have a single satellite and it's providing coverage over a really large area, could be the continental United States, could be the northern part of South America, could be Europe. And those systems are really the key and probably the best way to do things like direct broadcast or multicast capability, your TV to home, and in some cases even data where you're going to send the same data to a lot of areas. Now, those typically have around a 500 megahertz bandwidth. Each one's a little bit different. But somebody smart said, well, gee, how about if I use that same bandwidth over and over again, and instead of using one big beam, I use a lot of spot beams. So it allows you to use that bandwidth over and over again, and people would say, oh, this satellite has this much more bandwidth. And the net result is you can get much more throughput per satellite, and there's some economies of scale benefits that you get from that.
So obviously these high throughput satellites reusing the same frequencies over and over again sounds amazing. It sounds like I'm getting a lot more bang for my buck. Are there still purposes that FSS solutions are going to serve for us then?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think FSS is going to go away. And as I mentioned, FSS will be the better way to broadcast satellite for TV channels, as an example, or data that you're going to send to a lot of people in common. On the other hand, HTS, I think everybody agrees, even people who are big FSS fans, that HTS does have some distinct advantages, particularly with internet service where you're going to provide internet capability to individual people.
All right, so switching channels a little bit here, KA versus KU. There's been sort of a never-ending debate on that in terms of which is better and what the value proposition of each is. What's the main difference between a KU versus a KA HTS solution?
Well, I have to be careful here because I don't want to get in trouble. There's some people, very smart people, who have some really specific opinions in this area. At ThinKom specifically, we're agnostic, so we like both KU and KA. So let me just kind of try to be as generic as I can. KA has some advantages, particularly with respect to the satellite. So because it's a higher frequency, the wavelengths are shorter, the antennas for a given spot beam size can be smaller, and that can be an advantage in terms of how many beams you can put on the satellite, so on and so forth. KU can also do HTS, but maybe that's a fair advantage to KA. On the downside, KA has some issues with respect to laws of physics kind of things like rain attenuation. If you're always going to operate above the clouds, i.e. you don't have rain, this isn't a big problem. However, if you're going to operate under the clouds, particularly in an area where there's going to be a lot of rain, say in a gate-to-gate operation for an IFEC application, this is going to be a big consideration because it could reduce the availability of your service. KA also tends to be more aggregated, so the satellites, you might use as few as 3 satellites to cover an entire area. And the good news is you only have 3 satellites. The bad news is you only have 3 satellites. So there's issues with respect to reliability and single point failure on the satellites. And KU, in contrast, generally has hundreds of satellites available. So if you lose a satellite, it's certainly sad for somebody, but it's not a big deal for you to restore service by simply pointing to a satellite that's just a little further away. So it's a trade, it's a pros and cons.
And one of the interesting other challenges KU versus KA presents, most KA solutions today would be considered closed or proprietary solutions. You have your modem, your antenna, and you're talking to one constellation of satellites from one vendor, as opposed to KU, like you said, there's hundreds of them out there. I can talk to a broader collection of satellites if something goes wrong. What's the background on that, and where's that coming from?
The business tendency is if you have high assets, a few high assets, i.e. these aggregated satellites, and you've invested a lot of money in them, and you probably have a proprietary algorithms, proprietary frequency plans that you're using that works only with that satellite, that kind of sets you up for a proprietary system, meaning a system that's not going to work with other people, but opens up the possibility for you to do a vertical. So you're selling the satellite service, but you're also maybe doing the direct service and actually selling to the airlines yourself. And of course, I know that you cover that area very, very strongly, and there's a lot of good examples of people who are moving in that direction.
What if instead of KU or KA, I got greedy and said, I want it all. I want to do KU and KA. And we know there's some solutions out there providing it today. Is that the future?
I can see the attractiveness of that. And there are people who are really pushing that area. But even the people who are actively marketing KU, KA combined capability, even those folks will tell you that's a stopgap measure. In other words, it's something that may be required to fill in the 2 to 4 year gap period between now, when KA is mostly a regional service, a few exceptions to that, becomes a more globally capable service. And the other thing that I don't think is emphasized a lot is that generally that KU service you're going to be getting is really a backup service. It's not a replacement service. It may have 1/10 or 1/20th the data rate capabilities of the KA system. Granted, it's much better than not having any connectivity at all, but it's hardly a either or system. So then, because it's a backup capability, you have to ask yourself, is it worth the extra cost, the extra weight, the extra complexity to add that KU capability on top? and each person has to make their own decision.
All right, and if I'm an airline and I'm thinking about this today and sort of trying to make my decision, KU versus KA, HTS, FSS, trying to parse through all these different acronyms, what are the key decision points I'm looking at?
Well, kind of just to recap what we've talked about, KA is a really powerful regional player right now, moving to global. So if you need global right now, maybe that's a consideration. If you need global later, then I think KA has some advantages. I should point out, though, that KU is not going out of business. If you look 5 years, 10 years out, there's going to be plenty of KU satellites, so they're not really going out of style. And KU has wide bandwidth. They both have about 2 gigahertz of available bandwidth, so that's not really a big distinction. As I brought up the gate-to-gate, so weather may be a problem for you or not a problem with KA, that's a consideration. But when you sum it all up, I think probably the most important factor to people is going to be cost. And competition is good, I guess, in that sense, and the buyer has to, I'm sure, and will take that into account.
Great, thanks so very much. And thank you all for joining us here on Tech Talks. Stay tuned for our next episode coming soon.